Richard Sterling had always been the man people whispered about when he entered a room. His reputation as a billionaire deal-maker, a master negotiator, and a visionary entrepreneur preceded him everywhere he went. He had built an empire that stretched across industries, technology, finance, and real estate, each piece of his vast kingdom bearing his golden touch. But on that particular morning, in the tallest skyscraper in New York, Richard sat in his office staring blankly at the million-dollar contract spread before him. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands slightly trembling. Something was wrong. For the first time in years, he felt a chilling uncertainty clawing at his chest. The deal in question was not just another transaction. It was supposed to be his crowning achievement. A partnership with international investors that would elevate his empire to untouchable heights. But Richard knew he was slipping. The numbers no longer dazzled him. The strategies no longer sharpened his instincts. His confidence, once unshakable, now cracked under the pressure of eyes that expected nothing less than perfection. In the midst of this quiet storm stood Grace. She was his maid, invisible to the world, but always present in Richard's household. Grace was a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity. She moved silently through the mansion's marble halls, dusting priceless vases and polishing chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. Yet behind her calm eyes was a reservoir of intelligence and resilience that no one bothered to notice. She was there that morning, too, polishing the edges of Richard's oak desk, her eyes darting occasionally to the papers that seemed to torment him. She said nothing, but she saw everything. Richard barely noticed her. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the previous board meeting in which he had stumbled over his words. He had watched the investors exchange disappointed glances, their lips curling in subtle smirks. For the first time, the man known as the billionaire shark had looked weak. And weakness in his world was blood in the water. Later that afternoon, Richard entered the grand boardroom where the fate of his empire would be decided. The room was a theater of power, long mahogany table, crystal water glasses, leather, chairs filled with stern-faced investors from around the globe. Cameras from financial networks were stationed outside the glass walls, eager to capture every moment. Richard straightened his tie, masking the storm inside him with a thin veneer of confidence. But when the presentation began, his mask began to crumble. His voice shook as he walked them through the proposal. The slides flickered behind him. Graphs and numbers that had once been his weapon now looked like a foreign language. Questions came, sharp, cutting, merciless. Richard stumbled, contradicted himself, and even paused awkwardly mid-sentence, searching for words that refused to come. The investors' eyes grew colder. Their whispers turned into laughter hidden behind polite hands. By the time Richard reached the final slide, the deal was already slipping through his fingers. Grace had been sent to deliver coffee into the boardroom that afternoon. She carried the tray quietly, her head lowered, but she could not ignore what she saw. Richard, the man everyone feared and admired, stood defeated in front of a dozen powerful men and women. His empire was crumbling, not because of a lack of resources or opportunity, but because he had lost the confidence that once defined him. Grace's heart tightened. She had always known he was human beneath the armor of wealth, but now she saw him breaking. The meeting ended with silence. The investors pushed back their chairs, offering half-hearted handshakes that reeked of pity. Richard stood frozen, humiliated, his empire slipping away in slow motion. Grace glanced at him one last time as she exited the room. In her eyes burned something Richard did not notice, not pity, not shock, but an idea, a spark that would soon change everything. That night, Richard locked himself in his penthouse study. The city lights glowed beneath him, but he could not feel the usual thrill of dominance over the skyline. He poured himself a drink, his hand shaking as he set the glass down. For the first time, Richard Sterling felt like an imposter in his own skin. He had failed miserably in front of the world, and tomorrow, the headlines would devour him alive. Grace quietly entered to collect the empty plates from his dinner. She paused, noticing the crumpled documents on the floor, the untouched drink, and the man slumped over his desk. Something inside her refused to remain silent. She cleared her throat gently. "Mr. Sterling," she said softly, her voice carrying unusual weight. "Maybe the problem isn't in the numbers. Maybe it's in how you're telling the story." Richard looked up, startled. For a moment, he simply stared at her, his pride wrestling with his despair. Then he laughed bitterly. "And what would you know about billion-dollar deals, Grace?" Grace held his gaze, unflinching. "Nothing about billions, but everything about people." Those words lingered in the silence, sharper than any critique he had received from his board. He dismissed her with a wave, but as she left the room, Richard's mind replayed her sentence over and over again. The billionaire had failed miserably, but the maid was about to take the stage. The next morning, the world had already sharpened its knives. News outlets across the city plastered headlines that screamed of Richard Sterling's humiliating failure. "Billionaire loses his edge," read one. Another blared, "Sterling stumbles. Investors walk out on historic deal." The financial media was relentless, their anchors dissecting every pause, every stutter, every misstep Richard had made during the meeting. For years, he had been the face of confidence, a man who conquered deals with ruthless precision. Now, he was reduced to a cautionary tale. Inside Sterling Tower, the air was suffocating. Employees whispered nervously in the hallways, avoiding eye contact with one another. Richard's name had once been spoken with reverence, but now it was uttered only in hushed tones. The empire that once radiated power seemed fragile, its foundations shaking with every rumor that spread through the corporate grapevine. Richard himself was a shadow. He sat in his penthouse study, the curtains drawn against the rising sun, his mind replaying the investors' laughter on an endless loop. He had survived recessions, lawsuits, and hostile takeovers, but this was different. This was personal. It was his pride that had been crushed, and pride was the very core of Richard Sterling. Grace continued her duties quietly, moving about the mansion with her usual care. But every time she glanced at her employer, she saw a man unraveling. His once immaculate suits now hung loosely on his slumped frame, his once commanding voice now reduced to gruff mutters. She wanted to speak again, to remind him of the words she had dared to offer the night before. But something told her he wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. It was on the third day after the failed deal that Grace found herself standing at the doorway of the study once more. Richard was hunched over, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and crumpled notepads. He was scribbling furiously, muttering figures under his breath, his hair disheveled, his tie discarded. "Mr. Sterling," she said gently, "you can't fight the same battle the same way and expect a different ending." Richard froze, the pen slipping from his fingers. Slowly, he looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot but alert. There was no mockery in his gaze this time, only exhaustion, and something else, something like desperation. "And what do you suggest, Grace?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Grace stepped into the room, her hands clasped before her. She took a breath, gathering the courage that had been building within her for days. "You've spent your life speaking the language of numbers, contracts, and profits. But people don't always respond to numbers. They respond to truth, to stories, to what they can feel." Richard tilted his head, skeptical but curious. "Stories don't close deals. Money does." Grace's lips curved in a small, almost sad smile. "Then maybe that's why your deal failed? Because you gave them money, but you gave them nothing to believe in." The word struck him harder than he expected. For the first time, Richard wondered if perhaps he had forgotten how to inspire, how to connect beyond the boardroom's cold logic. He had built an empire, yes, but in the process, had he become nothing more than a machine chasing numbers? Still, his pride resisted. "And you think you can teach me how to inspire multimillionaires? You're a maid, Grace." "I'm a maid who's watched people my whole life," she replied calmly. "People who have everything and people who have nothing. And I've learned one truth. They all want to feel like they matter. If you can make them believe in your vision, not just your profits, they'll follow you." Silence filled the study. Richard stared at her, his mind at war with itself. He wanted to dismiss her, to retreat into the comfort of arrogance. But something inside him whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was right. Later that evening, Grace found him waiting in the dining hall, an untouched meal before him. His voice was quieter this time, less commanding. "If what you say is true, how do I tell them a story they'll believe?" Grace sat across from him, the first time she had ever dared to sit at the billionaire's table. Her eyes didn't waver. "By remembering who you were before you became Richard Sterling, the billionaire. By showing them the man who once had nothing, who dreamed bigger than anyone else dared, and who built something that mattered. Not just numbers. Humanity." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in days, Richard Sterling felt a flicker of something he had thought lost. Hope. But hope alone wouldn't save him. The investors had already announced a final meeting. Richard had one last chance to win them back, or the deal, and possibly his empire, would be gone forever. That night, as the city glittered outside the towering windows, Richard sat with Grace at his side. Together, they worked. She asked questions, forcing him to dig into memories he had buried. She challenged him to speak not about profits, but about purpose. And slowly, painfully, the speech that would define his future began to take shape. Yet Richard wasn't the only one changing. Grace, too, felt a transformation stirring within her. For years, she had been invisible, her voice silenced by circumstance. Now, here she was, guiding a billionaire, shaping the destiny of an empire with nothing more than honesty and courage. As dawn broke over the city, Richard leaned back in his chair, exhausted but strangely lighter. Grace gathered the scattered papers, her expression calm but resolute. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "you won't just speak to them as Richard Sterling, the billionaire. You'll speak to them as Richard Sterling, the man." And in that moment, he believed her. The silence before the storm was over. The stage was waiting. The day of the final investor meeting arrived like a thundercloud hovering over the city. Sterling Tower buzzed with tension. Suited executives moved quickly through the marble lobby, their phones glued to their ears, their expressions grim. Everyone knew this was no ordinary meeting. This was Richard Sterling's last chance to salvage not only a million-dollar deal, but the credibility of his empire. Failure today would echo across the financial world, shaking the very foundation of Sterling Enterprises. Richard sat in the boardroom long before anyone else arrived. He stared at the polished surface of the long mahogany table, his reflection, staring back at him like a stranger. In front of him sat neatly stacked papers, his speech, carefully crafted with Grace's guidance. Yet even as he read the words, his chest tightened. He could memorize them, repeat them, but could he believe them? Grace entered quietly, carrying nothing but a small notebook. Unlike the board members who would soon walk in dressed in Armani and tailored silk, she wore her plain uniform, her apron freshly pressed. To anyone else, she was invisible. But to Richard, she had become something else entirely, a voice he couldn't ignore. "You're not ready," she said softly, studying his trembling hands. He let out a heavy sigh. "I've been doing this for decades, but right now, I feel Like a fraud. Grace leaned closer, lowering her voice. Because you're still trying to be the Richard Sterling they expect. Forget them. Be the Richard Sterling who started with nothing and built everything. That's the man they need to. Here. Richard closed his eyes. Her words steadied him like an anchor. The heavy glass doors opened, and the investors began to file in. Men and women from London, Tokyo, Dubai, and Hong Kong filled the leather chairs, their expressions cold, guarded. They had come not to be convinced, but to watch a billionaire drown in his own failure. The room hushed as Richard stood, his notes trembling slightly in his hands. He cleared his throat and began. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you giving me this final opportunity. But the words faltered. The speech he had practiced collapsed under the weight of expectation. His voice shook, his eyes darted, nervously from face to face. A few investors exchanged knowing smirks, their pens scribbling notes that would soon become headlines. And then it happened. The words stopped altogether. Richard froze, his mind a blank canvas. The silence stretched. Unbearably long, the investors shifted impatiently. Some began to whisper. From the corner of the room, Grace saw it all. She saw Richard's collapse, the humiliation replaying itself, history repeating. And she knew she couldn't let it happen again. Before she could second-guess herself, Grace moved. She stepped forward, her footsteps echoing across the polished floor. Heads turned in confusion as the maid walked past the billionaire and stood before the powerful investors. A gasp rippled through the room. What was she doing? Richard's heart stopped. Grace, he whispered harshly. But she didn't stop. She turned to face the investors, her posture straight, her eyes unflinching. She did not carry notes, nor slides, nor numbers, only truth. You look at him, she began, her voice calm but firm, and you see a billionaire who failed. A man who stumbled in front of you, who forgot his words, who disappointed your expectations. But let me tell you what you don't see. The room went still. The investors, accustomed to polished presentations and empty promises, had never been addressed like this before. You don't see the boy who grew up with nothing, Grace continued, her eyes sweeping the room. You don't see the teenager who worked 3 jobs just to afford his first suit. You don't see the young man who slept in his office for months because he couldn't afford rent, who risked everything for a dream no one else believed in. That man built an empire, not because of money, but because of vision, resilience, and the courage to keep standing when everyone expected him to fall. Richard's breath caught in his throat. Her words were his story, the story he had forgotten how to tell. Grace's voice grew stronger, more commanding with each word. You want numbers. He can give you numbers. But numbers are meaningless without belief. What Richard Sterling is offering you is not just profit. He is offering you a future shaped by the same fire that turned nothing into everything. If you can't see that, then maybe you don't deserve to be part of what comes. Next, the silence that followed was electric. The investors stared, stunned, their pens frozen mid-note. They had expected desperation, excuses, maybe even begging. They had not expected to be challenged by a maid who spoke with the conviction of a leader. Richard looked at Grace, his eyes wide with awe. He had spent his life commanding rooms, but in this moment it was his maid who held them captive. One of the investors, a stern-faced woman from Tokyo, leaned forward, her voice breaking the silence. Who are you? Grace met her gaze without hesitation. I'm no one, just a maid. But sometimes it takes someone with nothing to remind you what's worth everything. The words cut deeper than any polished pitch could have. Richard found his voice again. He stepped forward, standing beside Grace, his pride set aside. For the first time, he spoke not as the untouchable billionaire, but as a man who remembered where he had come from. She's right. Richard said, his voice steady. I lost sight of why I started. I let numbers replace purpose. But if you want safe, predictable, lifeless profits, you can walk away. If you want vision, if you want to be part of something that outlives us all, then stay. Because this is not about me. This is about all of us building something that matters. The room fell silent once more. This time, not with judgment, but with thought. Investors exchanged looks, not of mockery, but of respect. Some leaned back in their chairs, arms crossed, considering. Others nodded slowly, their eyes no longer cold. For the first time since the failure, Richard felt the tide shift. And it wasn't because of him. It was because Grace, the maid who no one ever noticed, had taken the stage and reminded the world what it meant to believe. The boardroom felt like the eye of a storm. Grace's words still hung in the air, vibrating in every corner of the room, but no one moved. The investors sat frozen, pens idle, expressions unreadable. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Richard stood tall beside Grace, his heart thundering in his chest. He had never felt more vulnerable, and yet never more alive. This wasn't the boardroom performance he had planned, nor the glossy presentation he had rehearsed. This was raw, human, true. And it wasn't him who had pulled it off. It was her. One of the investors, a gray-haired man from London known for his ruthless skepticism, cleared his throat. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing on Grace. "You're telling us," he said slowly, "that we should trust a company, a vision, a future, because of a speech from a maid?" His words cut like knives, but Grace did not flinch. She met his gaze calmly. "I'm saying you should trust a man," she replied, "because he has already proven he can turn nothing into something extraordinary. I've seen him at his lowest. I've seen him fail. But I've also seen him rise again, not because he's perfect, but because he refuses to stay broken. If that doesn't convince you he's worth betting on, then nothing will." The investor's lips tightened, but he said nothing. His silence was louder than his skepticism. Another voice spoke, this time the woman from Tokyo who had asked Grace who she was. Her expression had softened, curiosity replacing doubt. "Richard Sterling," she said, "your maid has more conviction than half the executives I've met in this industry. If she believes in you this deeply, perhaps we've underestimated the value of what you've built." Richard blinked, hardly believing his ears. A murmur spread across the table. The investors began whispering to one another, debating in hushed tones. Some looked doubtful, others intrigued. But for the first time in months, Richard saw possibility flicker in their eyes. Grace stepped back quietly, retreating toward the edge of the room as if reminding herself she didn't belong at the center. But Richard turned to her, refusing to let her fade into the background. "Don't move," he whispered. "This is your victory as much as mine." The lead investor, a powerful figure from Dubai, finally raised his hand for silence. The whispers stopped instantly. His reputation was one of decisiveness. His word often tipped the balance in meetings like these. "We came here today expecting to witness a collapse," he said, his deep voice filling the room. "And instead we witnessed something rare. Authenticity. Not from you, Mr. Sterling, at least not at first, but from someone who reminded us of what this industry has forgotten." He paused, his eyes flicking toward Grace before settling back on Richard. "I will not speak for everyone, but as for me..." He set his pen down firmly. "I'm staying. In. My investment stands." The declaration was like a spark in dry wood. Another investor nodded, then another. The woman from Tokyo spoke again. "I'm in." A younger investor from Silicon Valley leaned forward eagerly. "Count me in, too." Not all agreed. Some pushed back their chairs, shaking their heads. "Too risky," muttered one. Another gathered his papers and stormed out, unwilling to tie his fortune to what he considered sentimentality, but the tide had turned. One by one, commitments were voiced, louder and stronger, until the balance tipped unmistakably in Richard's favor. By the time the murmurs settled, more than half the investors had pledged to stay. The deal was alive. Against all odds, Sterling Enterprises had been saved. Richard exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. He turned to Grace, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did it." Grace shook her head. "No, we did it. You just needed someone to remind you who you are." The investors began to file out, some offering firm handshakes, others nods of respect. A few still wore doubt on their faces, but it no longer mattered. The company would survive. The empire had been given another chance. As the last investor left, the boardroom doors closed with a soft thud. Silence returned, but this time it was not heavy, it was liberating. Richard leaned back against the table, running a hand through his hair, his eyes closing in relief. Grace stood quietly, clutching her small notebook, ready to slip away. But Richard opened his eyes and stopped her. "Grace," he said, his voice filled with something she had never heard before. Not command, not distance, but gratitude. "Why did you do it? You didn't have to. No one expected you to." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I know what it feels like, to be invisible, to have people look at you and see only your uniform, your job, your place. But I also know what it feels like to keep fighting when no one believes in you, and I couldn't stand by and watch you give up when I knew you still had fight left in you." Richard swallowed hard. For the first time in his life, he felt the sharp sting of humility, not as weakness, but as a gift. "You've given me more than a second chance," he said softly. "You've given me myself back." Grace smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Then don't waste it." But outside the boardroom, the storm had only just begun. News of the dramatic turnaround was already spreading. Journalists whispered of the billionaire who had choked and the maid who had saved him. Headlines were forming. The story would not stay contained within these walls, and Grace, who had spent her life unseen, was about to find the world's gaze fixed on her. The sun had already begun to set over the glass towers of the city, painting the skyline in shades of gold and fire, when the first headline hit the web. "Billionaire chokes in boardroom. Maid saves the day." Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire. News anchors scrambled to cover it, bloggers rushed to spin it, and social media exploded. By nightfall, Richard Sterling's failure and Grace's stunning intervention had become the most talked-about event in the world. Richard sat in his penthouse office, staring at his phone as notification after notification lit up the screen. For years, he had been the face of power, wealth, and control. Now, he was the man who had been saved by his maid. His PR team called in panic. "Richard, this is a disaster. We need to spin this immediately, deny, downplay, distract. We can't let people think—" "Stop!" Richard interrupted firmly. His voice was calm, almost unnervingly so. "For once in my life, I don't want spin. I don't want a mask. The truth happened in that room, and the world can see it. Let them." The line went silent. His team, unused to such defiance, could only murmur uncertainly. But Richard knew he meant it. Meanwhile, Grace was back in her modest apartment, staring at the flickering television in disbelief. Every channel replayed the moment she had stepped forward, her words echoing across the globe. She sat on the edge of her couch, her hands trembling, unable to process how her private act of courage had become a public phenomenon. Her phone buzzed constantly, neighbors, friends, even strangers reaching out. Some praised her as a hero. Others questioned her motives. But all eyes, for the first time in her life, were on her. and she wasn't sure if she wanted them to be. The next morning, the Sterling Tower lobby was chaos. Reporters swarmed the entrance, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, questions rang out in rapid fire. "Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to have your maid save your company?" "Grace, what inspired you to speak up in that room? Is it true you've been offered executive position since yesterday?" Grace tried to slip through unnoticed, but the crowd surged toward her. A reporter shoved a mic inches from her face. "Grace, do you think this proves that ordinary people can do what billionaires cannot?" She froze, caught between fear and honesty. Then, in a steady voice, she answered, "I don't think it's about billionaires or maids. I think it's about seeing people for who they are, not just what they do. Everyone has something to offer. Yesterday was just my turn to be seen." The lobby erupted with questions, flashes, cheers. Richard stepped forward suddenly, shielding her with his presence, guiding her past the chaos. Cameras captured the moment. The billionaire protecting his maid like she was the most important person in the building. Inside the elevator, away from the frenzy, Richard turned to her. "You've become the story. The whole world wants to." "No, you." Grace shook her head quickly. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to help." "And that," Richard said softly, "is exactly why they need to hear from you." That evening, Richard called a press conference. The world tuned in, expecting excuses, maybe even denials. But when the curtains parted, it wasn't Richard at the podium. It was Grace. She stood in front of a wall of cameras, her maid's uniform exchanged for a simple dress, her natural poise untouched. The room went silent as she began to speak. "I'm not a CEO," she said. "I'm not an executive. I don't know the language of deals and profits, but I do know people. And I know what it means to fight for something you believe in. Yesterday, I saw someone I work for, someone people call powerful, stand on the edge of losing everything. And I couldn't stay quiet. Not because I wanted recognition, not because I wanted attention, but because I believe that no one, no matter how high or low the world sees them, should be left to fall alone." She paused, her voice trembling slightly, then steadying again. "We all have something to give. And sometimes, the greatest strength comes from the places no one is looking." The press room erupted, not in chaos, but in thunderous applause. For once, the story wasn't about scandal or failure. It was about hope. In the weeks that followed, everything changed. Sterling Enterprises regained not just stability, but a renewed reputation. Investors praised the company's fresh humanity, and new deals poured in. Richard's image, once marred by arrogance, was reshaped by humility. He was still the billionaire at the helm, but now he was seen as the man who listened to, a Maid and Grace. She was offered job after job, consultant, executive, even public speaker. Universities invited her to talk. Nonprofits begged her to join. For the first time in her life, she had choices, but she stayed where she was, working quietly, humbly, still showing up at Sterling Tower with the same care she always had. When Richard asked her why, she simply smiled. "Because I don't need a title to know my worth. I already proved it." Richard looked at her with something beyond respect, something close to awe. He had built an empire, but she had built something greater: faith. Months later, on a quiet evening, Richard stood on the balcony of his penthouse, watching the city lights shimmer below. Grace joined him, holding 2 cups of tea. "You saved me that day," he said, taking one of the cups. "Not just the company, me." Grace smiled faintly. "And you gave me something too." "What's that?" "You showed me that even the people at the top can fall. And that's not weakness. It's what makes us human." They stood in silence, the city alive beneath them. 2 people from worlds apart, now bound by a truth neither could deny. Greatness isn't measured by money, but by courage, and sometimes the strongest voices come from the quietest corners. And though the headlines would eventually fade, the story of the billionaire who failed and the maid who saved him would be remembered forever.